Hello, everyone. We're back with another episode of About Sustainability, a podcast brought to you by the Institute for Global Environmental Strategies, IGES. This is Andre speaking, and this time Erin and I had the chance to talk to a fascinating guest about civic engagement, especially focusing on the Asia-Pacific Regional Civil Society Organization Engagement Mechanism, APRCEM. Simon also joined the discussion to provide additional insights, as he has a lot of experience in this topic. Rina, or Rina as she's often known, is originally from Indonesia. She's worked with the Asia-Pacific Forum on Women, Law and Development, APWLD, for 10 years, most recently as Deputy Regional Coordinator. She also acts as a women constituency focal point and one of the co-chairs of APRCEM. The APRCEM is described as a self-organized platform to support grassroots and marginalized constituency engagement with Agenda 2030. In the Pacific region and globally. The platform currently has more than 600 affiliated member organizations from across the region. Rina shared her views on why stakeholder voices need to be heard in SDG-related processes. She also spoke about how APRCEM and others are working to further strengthen civic engagement and ensure that a broad range of views, knowledge, and experiences are included in Agenda 2030. This is a frank, open discussion that should be informative to anyone who's unfamiliar with how major groups and other stakeholders factor into global forums on sustainable development. One little note to add here is that when we edited this conversation to make it short enough for the podcast, we cut out a bit where Rina mentions about major groups not having to wait their turn to speak after governments at certain forums. I refer to this in the latter part of the discussion, but it's missing from the earlier part. So that's just to avoid any confusion. With that little disclaimer out of the way, let's hear from Rina. Rina, welcome to the About Sustainability podcast. We're going to talk about major groups that take part in environmental negotiations, broadly speaking, and then with a bit of focus on your group, APRCEM, the Asia Pacific Regional CSO Engagement Mechanism. And CSO, they're standing for
Civil society, is it?
Civil society organization.
Yeah.
Thanks. But before we do that, I thought it would be good to just kind of define which negotiations we're going to be talking about and what those are, just for the person who is not familiar with this topic at all. Could you start there?
Sure. When we are talking about the negotiation that APRCEM mostly engage, is on the negotiation on the Sustainable Development Goals, or SDG, that is adopted in 2015, right? So we actually engage a lot in the sub-regional and regional process of the SDGs and also at the global level. And then, of course, in relation with the Sustainable Development Goals, there are other processes that also link to it, right? Including the financing for development, and also we also engaging a lot on the UN environment processes, including the UN Environment Assembly. So that is the engagement process that we are going to focus right now.
Okay, and so for UNEP Environment Assembly, of course, that's a UNEP thing.
Yeah.
And the SDG discussions, who's the body that oversees that? Who are you talking about there?
Yeah, we engage a lot with the high-level political forum, which is actually the body that really mandated to monitor the progress of the Sustainable Development Goals in the global level, right? And then in the regional level, the regional commission of each of the region is also mandated to have a regional preparatory forum before the actual HLPF, or high-level political forum. So there's a lot of engagement that is happening there, just to ensure that we, the civil society, and also with the other major group and other stakeholder, able to make an intervention or able to influence the discussion on that. Yeah.
Okay, and that regional forum is APFSD, right? The Asia Pacific Forum on Sustainable Development.
Yes.
Okay, so we did actually cover HLPF and APFSD in a previous podcast, so I just wanted to plug that for a second.
Sure.
Okay, and then about the major groups, because that's really what we're going to be focusing on here.
Sure.
Is it correct to say that you've got countries and you've got major groups? Those are basically the two sets of people at the negotiating table.
Yes, we have the member states, of course, that is actually engaging with the high-level political forum, and then also the major group and other stakeholder. Like as you know, that major group and other stakeholder is actually established long before, since the Earth Summit in 1992, because of the push from the civil society also that time to ensure the active participation of all sectors of society. One is women, and then also children and youth, and indigenous peoples, and NGO, and then local authorities, worker-centric unions, business and industry, scientific and technology community, and also farmers. So it's 9 major groups, but of course, like after a lot of conversation that is happening, especially in the Rio +20 conference, and then the document, the outcome document, which is the future we want, is really highlighting the role of the major groups that they can play in pursuing sustainable development, right? And then also have like several other groups that they felt need to be included, in the conversation.
So some of the categories I would imagine are far better represented than others, right? Like NGOs, for example, and local governments, perhaps, I'm guessing here. But groups like farmers, for example, are they represented as well, or is there just a very meager representation of some of these groups?
Yeah, I think that all of the groups that I mentioned is actually equally active.
Yeah, just to follow up on that, or maybe taking a step back, how were these 9 initial groups selected in the first place? Because I understand like women and then NGOs, like there are women in NGOs, and I just wonder like how these silos were created, I guess.
Maybe 2 points. So well, I think Rina mentioned that before. Those 9 major groups that we talked about a while ago, they came out of the Rio Earth Summit, where civil society pushed for an official and institutionalized recognition so that they could participate and influence and be watchdogs or have all kinds of roles in relation to sustainable development processes. That happened in 1992. And then we got those 9 constituencies or groups that Rina mentioned before. And that worked until around 2012. Then we had the Rio +20, and the key outcome of the Rio +20 then in 2012, that was the future we want. And in that outcome document, several other constituencies or groups were mentioned. And there was also a lot of research that came out around that time that basically discussed to what extent do those 9 major groups actually adequately capture the groups that have things to say and that have issues that they would like to be heard in the sustainable development processes. And maybe times have changed and it was time to update and perhaps expand those 9 major groups. And that's when we are getting into talk more about and learn more about the APRCEM, because that is clearly an expansion with many more constituencies and many more activities, as Rina will tell us about in a little while. And the second point, just really briefly, I wanted to make is to add to the question that Andre asked, to whether they are all equally represented. And you could say that, yeah, officially they are all, those that are recognized, whether they are 9 or 17 groups, they are officially recognized, and maybe then you could say they're equally represented. But it's not always the case. Some have a better organization than others, and some have more financial support than others, or are just better to navigate that intergovernmental field due to experience and different forms of capacity. And some need help. And this is also, I think, one very important role. And I think Rina mentions this. Rina, you mentioned this indirectly when you say, well, an important mission here is to democratize that space. And I think that's within the answer of democratization.
I'm just kind of wondering, this goes back to what Erin said a little bit. NGOs in particular already cover various other groups, right? So if you're a women's rights organization, for example, you can presumably decide whether you want to be there as an NGO or if you want to be under the women's grouping. And the same could be said for various others, right? There's this sort of overlap. And I guess that the groups that were selected because of some political pressure, presumably, and also just a recognition that those were particularly important groups. But I'm just kind of wondering, like, what justifies a particular group being identified as a group by itself rather than clumped under everything else?
I mean, I don't know the exact story about what happened. I think we can assume that there was some kind of pressure, and there was some kind of lobbying happening that created the space. But in those 9 major groups, you can see that most of them are, and what we have mentioned a couple of times today is, most of them are constituency based, and Rina can tell us more about why that is important. Some of them are not. For example, where we come from ourselves, we can be criticized because we are part of the scientific and technology major group. We could also be NGOs, but we are part of the. But it so happens that we fly the flag of the science and technology, and we don't have a constituency as such. Like we don't represent a certain group in society. So it's not 100% streamlined in that sense. It is diverse.
Right. Yeah, it would be unreasonable to expect it to be perfectly streamlined. I understand. Okay. So I did have some other general questions, but I think now is a good time to ask about APRCEM in general. And my main question about APRCEM, I mean, feel free to tell us a bit about what the organization is and its history. But what I'm most curious about is how it fits into that structure in the current negotiations. I mean, what is it regarded as by the General Assembly or by UNEP or whoever is administering the session?
Maybe better for me to actually just give it like a framing first and what is APRCEM and then how we evolve, because it's also a lot of evolution coming in relation with APRCEM, no? And then how we engage with the processes. So APRCEM, which is the Asia Pacific Regional CSO Engagement Mechanism, is a civil society platform that is really, is our objective, and our aim is really to enable stronger cross-constituency coordination, right? And then ensuring that the voices of all sub-regions of Asia and the Pacific are heard in intergovernmental process at the regional and global level. So the APRCEM is actually initiated, owned, and driven by the civil society in Asia Pacific itself, and then also seeks to engage with the UN agencies and member states on the sustainable development process. And then when we first established APRCEM in 2014, a year before the adoption of the SDG, we were focusing on engaging with UNESCO, which is the UN Economic and Social Commission in Asia Pacific that has mandate to hold and organize regional forums. But we see it that time as a very, strategic entry points, knowing the wide breadth of the SDGs issue, right? And then the possibility for us to actually mobilize more of the civil society and constituencies in the discussion, right? But we are actually keeping our mandate and vision to engage with the broader UN system in the region. So our vision is actually not only engaging with the SDG, but we want to engage through our different thematic working group to engage with the UN environment, for instance, or UN Women, and etc. So up until now, we have been actively facilitating the engagement of the Asia Pacific CSO with the 2030 agenda process, which I already mentioned earlier, the sub-regional forum, the APFST itself, the high-level political forum, and then we also facilitating the engagement of the grassroots, that this is very important for us, the grassroots and civil societies in the other processes like the UN environment. So why we establish? So the idea is actually coming, just like what I think Simon mentioned earlier, it's coming and really derived from the engagement experience in the process leading up to Rio +20 conference. Yeah. And then a lot of us, that time that is engaging with the sustainable development, civil society, NGO, trade unions, indigenous people, we come together and see what is actually the good and bad experience that we have engaging in these processes, right? So we found one thing that we found is that there's a huge gap between the global level process, which is mostly by the major group and other stakeholder, with the national process. And then how will the grassroots organization or national organization engage with that global processes? And then so that's why we felt that there's a need for us to actually strengthen the middle level process, which is the region, to actually ensuring that we also able to strengthen ourselves as a civil society. We're able to coordinate ourselves, consolidate our position, and then have the understanding, a more coherent understanding also in relation with this UN processes that might be very, very far from the national level organization, realities, for instance. So we felt that the regional process itself need to be strengthened because we felt the regional process give proximity. Like people might be hard to engage in New York, but maybe easier to go to Bangkok, for instance. So it gives proximity and also accessibility and relevance for the national local group and also grassroots organization. And then also we want to bring more voice of the Asia Pacific CSO. We reflect back and then looking at, this is actually relevant to our discussion before, the major group system. What is the weakness? What are the strengths, right? And then I mentioned about the strength about ensuring the representation of constituencies and etc. That is good, but also the weaknesses, because there's no regional or middle level process. It is very New York centric. It is quite top down. So we look at that time that how the discussion in the global level were found to be very far from the realities of the communities in Asia Pacific. The issue of lack of representation of the Asia Pacific civil society that engage in that global processes, right? Not only on the number and the quantity, but also on the level of substance. So whether that our own issues and our own demand and our own key policy recommendation is well represented in that global process, or it's represented by others. This is something that we actually want to change and also we want to strengthen, right? And then also there's a need for us to say that, hey, we need to be more coherent in our work. A lot of time that civil society that work in the regional process has been sporadic, primarily thematic. So those who are engaging with the UN environment or environment usually go together with women, is actually with UN Women, for instance, and CSW, they also work together, but not necessarily come together to talk about the common agenda.
Thank you. Quick question. You mentioned that a lot of the, I guess for the major groups, one weakness is that it's very New York centric and it's top down, but I'm just, having trouble understanding what that really means. Like, does it mean that NGOs and so forth in New York, or I guess in North America or wherever the West, quote unquote, get more representation, and therefore, is this like an Asia Pacific issue, or is it like a regional issue, or is it more like the constituencies?
Based from our assessment, right, and then of course this is coming not only talking about Asia Pacific, but we're also talking about the civil society in Africa and other region, Latin America. There's a gap in terms of, for instance, that enable them to directly engage.
Mm-hmm. And has there been any kind of friction with existing organizations and other major group representatives? Because, okay, so as far as I understand, APRCEM is open to membership from any existing group, right? Among the 9 groups, as well as the additional 8 that you mentioned or that you alluded to. But are there groups who would prefer to, I mean, of course, they can still do things by themselves, but are there groups who would prefer to only do things by themselves and not to have a coordinating mechanism? It's not come up.
No, I don't think so. I think that there's a really, collective realization that need to work together. Mm-hmm. I think that is mostly common theme from all of our discussion, right? Mm-hmm. And then also, yeah, like, and then that's true. Like, for instance, APRCEM, I haven't told you about, our structure and etc. But just to let you know, for instance, that we actually felt that having APRCEM in the NGOs is also enabled a more coherent linkages between the regional and global process, right? For instance, in APRCEM, we have 17 constituencies, yeah. We not only have 9 major groups, we also have the migrants, the people with disability, the LGBTIQ, the fisher folk, the people living and affected by conflict and disaster, people living and affected by HIV and AIDS. Some of this group is not yet recognized in the NGOS system, right? But some is already recognized, right? So for instance, my organization, APWLD, we are part of APRCEM, but we also the women major group, right? And then being with APRCEM is also enable us to strengthen our regional perspective together with the other women's group in the region to actually feed into the discussion in the women major group in the global level, right? So we don't see it as a redundancy, we see it how it strengthens our coordination and narrative that we built together, just to ensure that, like all this region perspective is also included, right? So that's how it is.
Okay.
Wow.
Within any region, there are certain countries where community organizations have less or more say in what the government does, right? And in the countries, the more authoritarian states, there's a lot less representation. So do you make special efforts to reach those people, the ones in countries where they, their relationship with the national government is insignificant? Maybe a grassroots organization that's trying, but it's struggling to get anything happening within the country where the conditions are just very difficult.
We also found, when we are actually doing our selection to APFSD, we have a lot of underrepresented countries, right? Or CSO coming from that countries. And then also we found difficulties, like for instance, like how they also want to represent themselves during that meeting, right? Like for instance, I'll just give you an example. As you may know that there's always a chance for civil society to speak on behalf of civil society and ask questions when the government is doing their voluntary national review, right? And then the representative is not comfortable actually to speak directly. They want to actually give their inputs, but they ask the committee, which is APRCEM that time, to be the one who's asking questions. So there is a situation, especially now with the situation of the shrinking civil society spaces in our region, like really attack of democratic rights, a lot of the intense militarization that is happening, especially to the human rights defender and environmental defenders, right? So we also recognize that issue. And then, but what we found is that, so safety and security is really like our core principles, but we also found that there are cases where having a regional and being part of the regional process and global process is actually help them with their work with the government in the national level. It's very funny. We found this, and then it's actually quite the same with the other region. When we reflected, it's actually the regional process opening more doors to the grassroots and national level organization in the national level.
Well, it gives them some anonymity, right? Like they can engage, they can have their say through you rather than having to stand up and be noticed especially by their own governments.
If they chose to.
If they choose to, yeah.
There's also one, isn't there, Rina, you said about selecting participants for, let's say, the Asia Pacific Forum on Sustainable Development. There are different criteria, right? Like some are, well, a participant, he or she, or they need to know about what's being discussed. So do they have substance experience on the SDGs that are being reviewed this year? But it's not only that, it's also representation. I mean, geographical and constituency representation. So maybe that just adds a little bit to Andre's question. I think in some cases, APRCEM looks at trying to make the most balanced, say, group of people to be there at any given year.
Yeah.
Several times a year, I learned APRCEM compiles a statement that represents all of its constituencies.
Mm.
But I also understand that you're representing a lot of different groups here, right? With a lot of different opinions. And I'm curious to know, I have listened in on other negotiations by member states, like government level negotiations, and that in itself seems very difficult. And I was just wondering, how you kind of create a coherent statement that everybody agrees with in the end. That's also strong and, impactful.
Yeah, because I think that from before in 2014, we have like around 75 organizations saying that, oh, we are part of APRCEM. And then now we have more, we have like around 688 that say that we are part of APRCEM. Okay. So one thing about how we actually consolidate inputs and position is not an easy task. It's not only putting the seat on the table, like what we said, ensuring that civil society is there, but also what are the things that we want to say, right? Like ensuring that we have substance to contribute. Right. We said that it's not possible that SDG will not happen if we don't tackle these systemic issues, yeah? And then so that is where it's coming from. So our position in relation with that is also coming from all the discussion of the newest systemic issue that we also identify, like for instance, during the discussion of the COVID-19, yeah, we're looking at into issue of the debt crisis in the developing countries. We look into the issue of, how the TRIPS, in relation with patent and then vaccine, and then what is the alternative and recommendation that we want for that, right? So we try to give that policy recommendation that tackle the systemic barriers. So so we have a political unity, of development justice. We call it development justice, right? Yeah. And then all that kind of discussion and confirmation, and then also sometimes it's also get challenged, right? And then we have another discussion. Sometimes we also change positions in relation with something, that is happening during our conversation in the People's Forum. Yeah.
So APRCEM as so any of the 9 existing groups plus the additional ones can be part, right? So that includes business and industry and the scientific and technological community. And not even just they, but also other groups might have different ideas of what developmental justice is, right? This is not an agreed upon concept. Like different people have different ideas about what exactly that entails. How do you resolve, or do you just not have very many representatives from business and industry in your group so that you don't need to worry about their perspective, or how does it work?
One of the things when we are, assessing the major group system, yeah, there's a lot of paper coming in that reviewing the major group and system that time, right? And one of the paper is produced by Global Policy Forum, yeah, GPF, and then which say that the major group system, while providing a structured means to manage diversity, right? It also been argued that how the major groups engagement mechanism also reduce the scope and role of the civil society engagement with the UN system.
Because some of the groups don't really represent civil society, right?
Exactly, exactly, right? So we are very clear that what we want to have is the civil society organization engagement mechanism, right? So the MGOS, so in that paper it's also said placing business and industry and local authorities in an engagement mechanism with civil society can dilute critical message, and then it's just going to the lowest common denominator, right? And then also the major group can also serve as a filtering role, right? We said that time, which can further limit the voice and participation of the regional representation. So we also see some of the, the aspect of the regional representation. So for us in APRCEM, we also reflect on that. We're very clear we want to have civil society organization, but we also so we have 17 constituencies. So our business and industry, we don't have the business and industry, but we do have social and community enterprise. Yeah, that is part of it. The enterprises that also have the social the vision for social justice and etc. So they are part of our APRCEM. We used
how do you decide if someone qualifies for that? Aren't you kind of doing a gatekeeping kind of function by allowing certain groups in and others not? I'm just kind of wondering how you avoid, how you maintain kind of openness if you put rules down like that,
Yeah, okay. So yeah, for the social and community enterprise, we don't actually filter anyone from the social and community enterprise, right? Because of course the SCE have different nature and then different vision and mission. If they say that they are part of the social and community enterprise, they immediately go to the APRCEM, right? We told ESCAP, right? Okay, we have the Asia Pacific Regional CSO engagement mechanism, but it doesn't mean that the UNESCAP cannot engage with the business and industry. They still can,
and they still do.
And they still do,
So no worries there.
Exactly. And then they also have the local authorities, they still do, engaging with them. So for instance, I think for me it's a very good practice, right? What ESCAP is trying to do, so not really pushing and then have everybody in one group, but have the civil society. We have which is have the civil society forum. The ESCAP and business have the 3 days, wasn't it, Simon? I think the 3 days Asia Pacific Business Forum before the APFSD to actually have their position and recommendation, and then also the local authority made their own engagement mechanism with UNESCAP. And then I think that it is for now it's very functioning very well, where we meet at the APFSD. So we don't want to say that we don't filter the voices, because our voice from the very beginning is for the civil society.
I guess maybe there is, to an extent, I mean, Andre, if you want to put it on the spot, there probably is a gatekeeping function just by the nature of how the network or the platform frames its engagement. But then, let's say business and industry, they wouldn't want to engage. They don't have a problem being heard anyway, so they don't necessarily need any help to make sure that their messages are heard, because they have dedicated forums for them already. When you talked about the business forum, 3-day business forum, yeah, I thought about what UNEP has now. It's called the Science Policy Business Forum, and you could think about what kind of connection science has with business there. So I think this goes both ways, really.
Yeah.
And then just to add on what Simon said, also the what do you call it? Chambers of Commerce or Chambers of Business and Commerce. They also have the observatory role, right, in the UN right now. So yeah. So aside from their part of the major group, they also have actually more role also in that kind of UN processes and etc.
Yeah, it's called observatory status. It's you basically have a guaranteed seat at the table.
So kind of something I should have asked at the beginning, so I'm not sure how it's going to work really. But so let me just ask the question, and then I was going to add a couple of little bits onto it. The main question was, why have major groups? What is so technically, if governments function properly, you wouldn't need major groups, right? Because the governments would represent all of the groups within their countries. And obviously
provided that it's a democracy, right?
The point is that there's no country in the world that's democratic enough to represent all its groups, right? No matter, and we can dream about a society like that, but it's never actually going to happen. So
Never say never, but maybe in the far future, yeah.
Yeah, I think human nature is a bit of a brick wall there, but anyway. But I'm just kind of thinking back to what you said about at HLPF and APFSD. You said that the major groups, I might be getting it slightly wrong, but the major groups had kind of equal say to the governments, that they didn't have to wait until all the governments had spoken. They could speak sort of when it was their turn to speak, kind of thing. But I know that at other forums in the UN, maybe more formal forums like the CBD, which is the one I'm most familiar with, and UNFCCC, and I guess also UNEA as well. It's still the case that the governments have the right to speak first, and if there's time remaining, then the major groups will be allowed to speak. And somehow you guys got past that stumbling block, and I guess partly because HLPF and APFSD are less formal forums, so I'm making an assumption there. But my question really was like, and it's just a devil's advocate question. These are United Nations forums, right? So they're supposed to be forums of the nations, of the countries. So why should major groups have an equal say in these forums? And that's kind of another way of asking the question, I guess, why major groups exist in the first place. So like I said, that would have been better at the beginning of the discussion, but maybe you can answer it in a sort of a retrospective way.
Actually, Andrea, I never said that, the major group have an equal say,
Not equal, but they're able to speak in turn, right, with the government, which kind of implies some kind of
but it also depends on the chair. If you have a chair that's open to civil society, then you will see that can happen. But if you have one that's not, then it may not at all happen.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that for us in APRCEM, we understand that the importance of multilateralism, and then respecting the multilateral process. We understand that this is a space for the member states to actually able to discuss and then have an agreement. That is one thing. Yeah, we do understand that, right? What we are actually, I think, like for the other process, like for instance, like I myself, I also part of the CSW process, for instance, and then there's a, what do you call it? Rules of procedure, on how you actually able to make an intervention, how much time, and then when, and etc., etc. And then we also fully respect that, For the high-level political forum, of course, there are differences, because one is that the multi-stakeholder approach that it's bringing, right? So I think that there is always what the government say that, oh, HLPF is different because this is using multi-stakeholder approach. So we are more relaxed on our rules of procedures and etc. etc. And then so that's why there's a way for us to actually giving more of our inputs, in the middle, not at the end, etc.
Okay.
Right? So we do recognize that. I think that there's a lot of debate about the multi-stakeholderism. I think that in some part that what we are trying to do in APRCEM is actually to maximize the opportunity and presence that we have in this HLPF, and then in a way that we think also it can sort of like influence other processes. Like for instance, we actually use the best practices of the ministerial declaration, for the HLPF to the CSW process of looking into the outcome document, and then also influencing the negotiation on the methods of work. And then we also using HLPF process, especially on the regional role. So for now, for instance, for APWLD, because we are engaging with the CSW, we actually also demanding the regional forum prior to the CSW in New York in March. So we now have that kind of process, right? And then apparently, also happened in the UN environment where they already have the regional process before, but our work in HLPF is giving more weight to that, to our role in facilitating CSO engagement in the region in terms of the UN environment issues.
So Rina, okay, so you're saying that the experiences but also the modalities. I mean, the more open, more relaxed multi-stakeholderism practiced in the HLPF sort of through your work actually gets translated and can benefit or gets to influence other processes as that one under gender equality or women's empowerment. That's what you're saying, right? Okay, and then on Andre, yeah, if the governments were perfectly representing us, then there would be no need for 9 or 17 or 25 or 51 groups at all. But I guess that's sort of the conundrum about sustainable and development, that it's bound to have some hardcore tensions within it. And when there are these tensions between sustainability and development, then you can't get to represent everybody at the same time. And then you need to have these voices in. That's just my personal opinion. That's necessary salt and pepper.
Yeah, that's a good point. Even if the governments were listening to everyone equally, they wouldn't be giving one opinion, right? Because there'd be conflicting opinions to represent.
Yeah.
There is, like there might be, we should aim for, inclusive and democratic multilateralism. It doesn't mean that it has, multilateralism is actually only focusing on the member states, right? But we can actually open it and then have a more inclusive way to ensure that these voices on the ground able to get heard in this kind of process, right? So that is actually what I want to say, that aside from the debate about multi-stakeholderism or not multilateralism, but we can, and we should aim for the inclusive and democratic multilateralism in the UN. Okay.
And by that you mean multilateralism that includes not just the countries but the groups as well, right? That's your definition of true multilateralism.
Well, inclusive multilateralism that gives space. So maybe not in an equal footing, because still the multilateralism between states is important, but it really gives space, and for the civil society, for the groups, for the constituency, for the people who are affected the most, from the conversation that they are happen there, to actually able to give and meaningfully to give their inputs, contribution, and meaningfully engage, right? And then not necessarily just participation, but it means that they can actually give inputs to the documents through the member state, through the co-facilitator, and then able to get heard in that kind of space.
Thank you for listening to About Sustainability. Please subscribe at podcast.iges.jp or search for About Sustainability wherever you normally get your podcasts. If you've got feedback, you can review us on your podcast directory of choice or reach out on Twitter at IGES_EN. About Sustainability is produced by the Institute for Global Environmental Strategies. Any views expressed during the podcast are those of the speaker at the time of recording and do not necessarily reflect the views of IGES. Thank you for choosing to spend your time with us. We don't take that lightly, and we hope you'll join us next time.